And I think, as you said, like as we're moving forward with this field, I think one of the benefit of it is like it helps us to experience touch in a different way. Because I can imagine for many cisgender women, touch felt threatening, right? Like,
Yeah.
people could have said like we experience lots of touch as a villain situations. Like, we
Yes.
have to be reading meaning to a touch very quickly in all sorts of
Yeah.
situations. So, and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like takes away from that comfort of, okay, I'm here to receive, I'm here to embrace this touch. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sexology Podcast. I am so excited to welcome Epiphany Jordan to our show. Epiphany, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here as well. I appreciate you inviting me on.
I am very intrigued with this topic. I know we're going to talk about touch and importance of physical touch. And just before we started the recording, you mentioned how it's context related, culture related. So I'm very curious to learn more about how you got interested in this topic.
That's a great question. So, in the mid 2000s, I was studying sacred sexuality with a woman out of Atlanta, Georgia. Her name's Anara DeLuna. Her offering was the Temple of the Red Lotus, and she was primarily in the pagan space. And she's like, here we are talking about worshiping the goddess, and yet we're not talking about the goddess in her sexual aspect. And so I went to a festival with her, and she had this offering that was called a Karuna Session that was just non-sexual touch. And I was really struck by how profoundly the people who were coming in were being affected by this. And I thought about it and thought about it and thought, it was one of those things that just wouldn't stop bothering me. And so in 2013, a friend of mine and I started playing around with the session, with the format, and people were like, this is really great. You should turn it into a business. So we did that. And then, I just, the more I dove into this topic, I was like, wow, this is actually very complex, and it hits so many different areas of our lives. And, yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of it out there. And in 2019, I wrote a book, Somebody Hold Me, The Single Person's Guide to Nurturing Human Touch, because when you're not in a romantic relationship, you don't necessarily get your touch needs met. Actually, that can be true within a romantic relationship as well. And I've been just, during the pandemic, I shuttered my business and decided to go back to school and get a master's in public health, because I was interested in using touch for wellness programs, and graduated with that last year. And I think you and I are going to be talking some about the research project that I did on touch. So
I'm very interested to learn more about the findings you had around touch and people's reaction to touch. You mentioned such a great point that oftentimes when people come to our offices, I know in my therapy sessions, I would talk about physical intimacy being different than sexual intimacy. And one of the things that happens is when you are in a sex-starved relationship, non-physical touch also disappears because the people are scared of the expectation, but that also creates additional need.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of like, I know other people who are professional cuddlers, and everybody who kind of works in this industry is like, well, our culture doesn't separate touch from sex, and is problematic. I mean, you even see that within sex work. It's like, if you read literature by sex workers, there, a lot of them talk about, I have men come in and they just want to be held for an hour and talk. So it's pretty important. And it's something that tends to, like you said, in romantic relationships, go by the wayside, because that paradigm of touchable sex affects married people as well as single people in not very good ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know in your work, you emphasize the importance of physical touch. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And also, you're talking about how everyone pretty much need it. Tell us more about that need.
Okay. So the need for touch is actually not just a human thing, it's mammalian. I mean, you see animals, all mammals kind of like cuddle together and huddle together. Our species started out as that when we were living in caves. We, slept in big piles for warmth and safety. Humans were even doing that up until about 100 years ago. They do still in some parts of the world. If you live without electricity and you live in a cold climate, you're going to be sleeping in a bed with your entire family to keep from freezing to death at night when fuel is scarce or expensive or what have you. And it's also how we start out our lives individually as human beings. There's tons and tons of research on the importance of touch for neurological development and making sure that infants and babies have a lot of that touch kind of sets them up for the rest of their lives in terms of attachment and emotional regulation. There's touch and its underlying chemical that's generated, oxytocin, the hormone that's generated when you touch people, has tons and tons of great health benefits. It helps counteract the effects of cortisol in your heart. It lowers your blood pressure. It reduces inflammation. It boosts your immune system. They found that it can counteract the effects of alcohol. It's a pain reliever. It can reduce appetite. There's all these huge health benefits, and yet we don't really think about it in terms of our physical health. And then, as to your question, does everybody need it? I'd say that that's true. I don't know exactly how, if there's an exact percentage of people who do or don't need it. I think people have different levels of touch drive or touch need, similar to sex drives. And the reasons for people not wanting or needing touch is super individual. A lot of times it can have to do with whether or not people were physically abused as a kid. I find that one a lot. That's often one of the first questions I ask people when they say, "Oh, I don't like to be touched." It's like, yeah, my upbringing was pretty screwed. It could be a physiological thing like autism. It could just be sensory sensitivity, or a trust thing. It could be religious. It could be where you grew up. I know you said that you lived in Iran till you came to the States for college. Where is your family Muslim?
My family actually are this very atheist. The background for that is I was born right after Islamic Revolution, and
Mm-hmm.
government like out of blue kind of like they started implementing and forcing people to kind of have certain kind of religious kind of like doing and beliefs which was not aligned with my family. So that's why like my family even got like further away from religion. But I know you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about how culture impacts touch. What's interesting for me is because I grew up in the very kind of interesting time, even in Iranian history, that was out of the
Mm-hmm.
blue. Then, like, you have to cover everything, and women are actually more eroticized because even if you had a hair out, like people say, "Oh, that is sexy." I remember that I had to constantly be hyper vigilant around touch because any
Yeah.
touch was like a form of even kind of assault. Like, a constantly people want to touch the developing woman's body, which is scary. So that's was a little bit of rant about my background about touch. But were you thinking about the impact of religion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's in the Abrahamic religions, there's so much shame and pleasure is demonized, and the physical body. I mean, a lot of religions are like that. You think about like monks going and sitting on a hill by themselves to meditate and get closer to God. Um, there's definitely a lot. I lived in Texas for about 20 years, and boy, there were a lot of people that I came across whose religious upbringing had really done a number on them. I'm curious. I understand. My father's actually Muslim, or was. So I understand this desire to, to cover women and so forth. Can you tell me a little bit about touch between women? Obviously, you couldn't touch men outside of your family, your father or your brothers or what have you, but what was touch like between women?
It's very interesting. I think again, my family might be slightly different. So overall, touch among women were more okay. But
Hmm.
I observed based on like my lens as a sex therapist, because the relationship with opposite sex was just so taboo that sometimes people even eroticize female to female connection and touch, which can take
Uh-huh.
away from that beauty of the physical touch that we're talking about. Now that I live here,
Right.
I've been here more than 20 years. I love when my friends they hug me, kind of like they kiss me. They're just so sweet. But I feel like
Hmm.
even there was some pause fearing, even like when I was younger, about female touch because it was just so eroticized.
And in Iranian culture, were men physically affectionate with men? I know you see that in a lot of cultures where there's a lot of separation between men and women, that you see men walking down the street with their arms around each other, holding hands, and nobody bats an eye.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think more customary there than here, like at least in California.
Oh, definitely. Well, all over the United States. I mean, California is pretty open in that way, but yeah, I mean, I feel like that taking or having that not be an option for men has been so terrible. I see beautiful, beautiful images from about 100 years ago of men being really affectionate with each other, sitting on each other's laps, holding hands, just hugging each other, and it's so sweet. And that having that option taken away for a lot of men has been really tragic for them and has really cut them off from touch. Yeah.
Sorry for interruption. What showed up for me is that also how how challenging it is, like limits the space for people to receive non-sexual touch, even in the kind of like a non conservative communities, right? Because I think before I kind of got like in the relationship that I am, the shift that in my life. I think for me, physical touch, except the kind of like a sibling to parents touch, was all sexual. So there's no
Hmm.
space for non sexual, non relative touch.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's something that I think is contributing to people's loneliness and isolation and disconnection in a huge way.
Mhm. You talk about and like your writings that physical touch has a branding issue. Tell us more about that. What do you mean by that?
So the what branding is, how companies distinguish themselves from each other in the marketplace, but it's also how a consumer sees a particular product or service. And in this case, as we've said, it's like, we're talking about touch equals sex, or touch equals familial things. And that's something that's really limiting for people. That this is, because we only think about it in this way, it leaves a lot of people out of the equation. It leaves a lot of people without access to touch.
And you talked about brand archetype for touch, which I find it very interesting and intriguing. Can you tell us more about those?
Yes. So when I had put in my statement of purpose when I was applying to graduate school that touch has a branding problem. The way we think about it doesn't work for people. And I ended up getting into this program at the University of South Florida, which is called social marketing. It's kind of a hybrid between marketing and public health. And my faculty advisor challenged me. She's like, "You say that touch has a branding problem. Figure out how you would rebrand it." And so I did all this research on different branding frameworks, and I settled on storytelling and brand archetypes. And then social marketing is very dependent on qualitative interviews. You pick a priority population. In my case, it was single women in their 50s who still wanted a romantic relationship but weren't able to find it. And so what I did was I read them 3 different stories about different ways that they could get their touch needs met and got their feedback on it. And I also asked them about the current stories that we see, in the media or, in our friends or just in society in general. And I was able to narrow it down to 3 current brand archetypes that we have. The first is touch as lover, which we've been talking about. And then the second one is touch as caregiver, which is familial touch, where parents are using touch to raise their children. And then the third one is not an actual brand archetype, but it's so prevalent that we can't not talk about it, which is touch as villain, which is talking about so many people have had bad experiences with touch, and it keeps them from trusting other people and being able to get the touch they want and need. It affects them across the board. And all 3 of these archetypes aren't working for various reasons. More of us are single than ever. I just saw the statistic the other day and I haven't had a chance to dig into the study, but the latest Pew Research study, 54% of single people have not had sex in the past year. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. And then touch as caregiver, that used to be a really great way for older people to get their touch needs met when we lived in intergenerational households and the grandparents would take care of the young ones. I know that that was after my father died. And my mother's granddaughter was born. She spent a lot of time with her, and she was just kind of like, no, I don't want to date again, because she was getting those touch needs met from her grandchild. But also, I think for people who are parents, the touch is very one-sided. Gimme, mommy, help me. And you hear people who are parents talk about being touched out, where they're like, get your hands off of me. Don't, if you want something from me, then I'm not interested. And then touch as villain, between sexual assault and childhood sexual abuse, it's like so many of us have had these terrible experiences with touch. And so those are kind of the 3 primary brand archetypes that are in our world that you see in the media, like you see, like it's very acceptable to see violence, but it's not acceptable to, see people being tenderly romantic with each other. Or actually, that's not true. That's the only kind of touch you see, or you see like these images of happy families on the beach. And so, if you're not in a romantic relationship or you don't have kids or what have you, then it can be a very lonely thing for
Mhm.
people.
How, it seems like that's an area that you kind of studied and explored. To tell us how these brands, kind of archetypes, kind of evolve. Do you see kind of nuances among these different archetypes, or you restructured them?
Yes, I ended up because the project was about rebranding. So I took the current brands and then through data analysis, I came up with new brands that seemed like that resonated with people from the stories I told them. So the first one is Touches Revolutionary, which I love. I think that there's no better way to go against the American myth of rugged individualism than being connected with each other, being tender with each other, being kind with each other, taking care of each other through touch. It's a really small gesture that can have a really big impact. And in this, it's like we're looking at, really, really facing this idea of, hey, the way that we currently think about touch doesn't work. And um, looking at different relationships or different configurations to meet our touch needs. One of the big ones is I know so many people who are they're not in a romantic relationship, but they have wonderful, wonderful, close, intimate friendships. And it's like, let's normalize spending time touching our friends. It's great to have a hug or good hello or goodbye when you meet, but what about more intentional touch or cuddling or snuggling or holding people, out in that? It's really taboo. I mean, I have friends that I cuddle with and people are just like, what? Wait, no, that's weird. And we're not having sex, they have other relationships. We're just friends. But we all see, we see the value in doing that. Second one was touch as magician. A word that came up a lot when I was interviewing people was transformative. They talked about having gone through a breakup and then getting together with friends and having a brunch or something. And they got this really, really long hug. And it was like, I almost cried. So this is the touch as magician is about bringing the sacredness back into this idea of touching other people and realizing the enormous responsibility and the transformative nature of it. It's a really great archetype for people who've been through a bad experience. Maybe they've been through a sexual assault or something, or even just, or having your partner die or something, this idea of just being able to be, have somebody touch you and have it be caring and that's all that it is. There's no danger of it going any further and you can have control. And I think it's a beautiful way for people to be able to trust each other again when they've had a traumatic experience that involves touch or sex. The third archetype that came up was touch as explorer. As we've been talking about, this is enormously complicated. Who you touch, why you touch, when you touch, where you touch can be influenced by gender, family upbringing, religion, culture, power, your position in the world. Like a hug between an employer and an employee means something completely different to each of those people. And Touch as Explorer allows people to really kind of go through it and figure out, what they're comfortable with and, where the barriers are, and gives them a chance to do some research on why touch is important and really kind of analyze for themselves because it's an incredibly individualistic thing. And then the fourth archetype that came out was touch as caregiver, but revamped where the emphasis is on touch for the caregiver instead of the caregiver giving touch. One of the things about the brand archetype of the caregiver is that they're selfless and, they're just giving and taking care of. And it's like, who cares for the caregivers? Our culture greatly undervaluates caregiving. I mean, you think about professions like nursing or childcare or being a nursing aide, a massage therapist, a lot of these things or even mothering, it's like we don't value it. A lot of these jobs are very low paying and, have a high rate of burnout. And, especially for, and for mothers as well, it's like, let's focus on taking care of our caregivers through touch, and I was really surprised when I had my hands-on business, Karuna Sessions. One of our biggest, most enthusiastic customer groups was new mothers. I said that we were making a deposit in their overdrawn nurturing bank, so it's like, here, let's give you a respite from caregiving and we'll take care of you. And then when you go back to it, then you have more energy and something to give instead of like giving from this space of emptiness. So I love these because it makes touch more inclusive and accessible to more people. And people's needs for touch will change over a lifetime. It's like there's times in our lives when we may want more sex, and then there's a time in our life when we're grieving and we may want more comfort or we're stressed out and we need to relax, and it gives us more possibilities for getting our touch needs met and improving all of our relationships and our health.
What an interesting lens to have around touch. And I like your branding is so much better than the original one because of how expansive it is. As you were talking about this different archetypes, I was thinking about the newer one to me that as you were talking about it, it was very profound. I was thinking about touch as a magic. So
Mhm.
as a therapist, I've been trained recently in doing psychedelic assisted therapy. So there's a colleague of mine that she has also been through the field. She's like more advanced than me, and as part of the training, you do different things. One was ketamine assisted integration, and one was with psilocybin. And
Mhm.
which was interesting as part of the integration. I think so these are scary things. I have trauma in my past, so going deeper on those moments can be very scary, especially for those who haven't done ketamine assisted therapy. The infusion I've done is like it almost opens the door, like you're looking at this
Yeah.
door that you haven't looked at. And I know with this
Yeah.
colleague that I really trust, she's so loving and touch is her love language. And she held me and she kissed me and she was so supported throughout both of those journey that made it safe
Oh,
for me
wow.
to
That's
have a different
incredible.
experience and kind of like had that magical feeling. So as you were talking
Mhm.
about touch as a magic, I was thinking about that kind of like those experiences that was very healing and kind of like transformative.
Yeah. Yeah. You reminded me too. Somebody sent me an article several years ago about a group of nurses, I think, in Great Britain in the 50s and 60s who were doing LSD therapy, and they were holding people as they were integrating.
Mhm.
Ah, I love that. And I think about I was when I was doing Karuna Sessions, I worked with some sex therapists. I don't know if you know Susan Kay.
No, I don't
She's
know
in
her.
she's in Texas. She was a surrogate partner and she became
Mhm.
a sex therapist, and she trains surrogates, and it's the triadic model, right, where you have the patient, the surrogate, and the therapist, and the patient will go see the surrogate, and then the surrogate will report back to the therapist, and then the therapist processes the
Mhm.
experience with the patient. Um, and so it was, I was super intrigued by the idea of even, like going into a therapy session with a client, and being thinking about like being able to hold them as they go through this, talking about what happened to them, processing their traumas. So and I've got a lot of layman's experience with psychedelics myself, so I'm really curious to see where all of these different areas those are, using this in therapeutic ways kind of turns up. And I love the fact that your friend was able to give you touch that felt soothing and helped you to integrate.
Mhm. It
that's
helped me to
that's
go
really incredible.
deeper. Yeah, and I think as you said, like as we're moving forward with this fields, I think one of the benefit of it is like it helps us to experience touch in a different way. Because I can imagine for many cisgender women, touch felt threatening, right? Like,
Yeah.
people could have said like we experience lots of touch as a villain situations. Like you
Yes.
have to be reading meaning to a touch very quickly in all sorts of
Yeah.
situations. So and that
Hmm.
kind of like takes away from that comfort of, okay, I'm here to receive, I'm here to embrace this touch. So for
Yeah.
people who want to have this more in their life, the touch that feels kind of like nurturing and loving, but not necessarily sexual. There's nothing wrong with sexual touch, which is the whole
No.
point of our show. But what can they do to fill their cup in those ways?
So that's going to look different for everybody. Are you talking specifically about people in relationships or
I'm talking about people in
singles or?
relationships, and and as you mentioned, that I was thinking about many of my clients that they are single, like later stage of life, and they go to get massages or pedicure, not because they need pedicure, and
Yeah,
they just like go there for the touch. So as you said, it
yeah.
can look different for different people. What are some of these kind of venues that people can explore for getting that needs met?
Like you said, there's definitely a lot of transactional touch that's available out there. Whether that's getting your hair cut or getting a pedicure or getting a massage. One of the things that I talk about a lot for single people is, because we have this idea that touch equals sex, it's like we all think that when it's one person touching another person, that it's going to be sexual. And so if you do it in a group setting, then it becomes a social activity. And I'm not going to lie, I always say this, it's going to be fucking weird and awkward. But it's like, because it's like that getting past that hump. But once you do it, everybody's like, oh my God, this feels so good. So, doing things in a group setting and having it be very structured, like, okay, we're going to do this exercise, where I touch your hand and then you touch my hand. And, again, that feels kind of weird and stiff, but, it helps because you're creating this new frame of reference because we don't have common social scripts for how to touch your friends. I came up with this framework. It's the 4 S's. So structured is one of them. Slow is one of them. It's like we always kind of want to go in our heads to, oh, God, it would be so weird to like cuddle with your friends, but it doesn't even have to be like that. It can be as simple as like like holding hands over the table while you're talking. You meet up for coffee or something. You can do that. Having somebody put their hand on your shoulder, sitting next to somebody on the couch where your shoulders are touching and that your thighs are touching, it doesn't a little touch can go a long way. So there's slow, there's structured, there's specific. We rarely ask for what we want or we ask people what they want. Is that, am I going too slow? Am I, does that feel ticklish or whatever? So, and it takes some people some time to figure out what they want, which is also a good reason to do exercises and, play around with it in that way. And then safe is the last of the S's, this idea that, people are coming in with different traumas with, different, it can even be like injuries, or, that people, it's comfortable for me to sit on the chair, but I can't get down on the floor, or, just this idea of that everybody's going to be different. Everybody's had different life experiences and everybody's going to be bringing different things in. The other thing that I would suggest for people is, it's like there's so much shame and embarrassment around this. I talk to people all the time who are like, single people, especially, who are like, I'm touch starved. But they don't tell that to people who could actually do something about it. One of the stories that I read to my participants was a woman who had just gotten divorced. She was not happy with dating. She's at brunch with her friends, and afterwards they go to the park, and she's like, I don't miss my husband. I don't miss having sex, but I miss like sleeping with him at night. And she asks her friends, she's like, I saw this video where this woman was like cuddling with her friends. Would you be interested in doing that? And, her friends were just like, like one of her friends was like, absolutely not, and ran off. But the rest of them kind of stayed with it. Every single person I read that story to was like, that was so brave of her to ask. Um, and it's like, so many of us are feeling this way, but nobody wants to talk about it. It's like, it's something that we need, but that we don't want. It's like there's so much shame, so much embarrassment. I should be getting it through my romantic relationships. I should be getting it with, I should have a better relationship with my family, whatever. There's all these shoulds that, but it's like so many of us are feeling the same way. We're feeling isolated, we're feeling lonely, we're feeling touch starved. And breaking the ice, and it may be that your friend is like, nope, sorry, that's too weird for me, I can't do it. But they may say yes as well.
So beautiful, kind of asking what you need. And I think especially for many women, that's not a skill that was taught. And for men in this space feels threatening, the meaning that comes with it. So I think that
Yeah.
also doesn't feel safe. What a beautiful structure, kind of like a flow and structure you created with SS. I think structure can create lots of safety. It can be a container. This is a container we're exploring touch, so it can help people to relax in it.
Yeah, and once you create that similar frame of reference, then it becomes easier. Then you could call up your friend and be like, "Hey, will you come over and sit on the couch, snuggle up on the couch with me and watch a movie?" And your friend won't be like, "Why are they asking me that? Do they have a crush on me? They haven't told me." And it just makes it easier for people to do it. But it's like you have to first create that frame of reference, create that structure. It's also good, I think, if you have things where you're giving versus receiving, and you switch,
Mhm.
so that people kind of get used to, or, get used to this idea of like, oh, it doesn't have to be this, this thing that's kind of amorphous, where we're making a lot of assumptions about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it seems very stiff or weird, but the end result is really good. I
Mhm.
mean, sometimes I can take people through exercises where, like they're just touching each other's hands. And they're just like, oh my God, that feels so good. People
Mhm.
are just like, they're really amazed once they did it.
Well, one thing I wonder that many people are curious about is I don't know how to do non-sexual touch. I'm sure that's something that comes up a lot. What do you say to those people that they say like, okay, if we're doing hand touching, I don't know what to do?
Well, this is the next book I want to write. I want to write a book about non-sexual touch for couples. It's kind of been floating around my head. Now that I'm done with school, I can make it happen. Um, so I really like this idea of, well, I think first it's important to talk about it outside of the bedroom, not when you're getting sexual. Um, and to really, I think it's really helpful for couples as well to do the giving and receiving, like where you set a timer for 2 minutes and it's like, okay, I'm going to touch your hand. I'm going to, stroke your face, or, run my hand down your arm or something. And asking for feedback, does that feel good? Like, does it feel better? Some people, like they go like this a lot when they touch you. And sometimes it's just like, just leave your hands still, so it gives people an opportunity to figure out what they like, but also to just, to really do the back and forth, okay, I'm just going to touch your hand. Maybe they do it in a way that, maybe they're not doing it in the bedroom, maybe it's happening on the couch in the living room, or sitting on the floor, someplace where it's not necessarily a sexually charged kind of thing. But the going back and forth, I think, is really happy. And also realizing too, like you were talking before about, when couples get in a space where they stop having sex, then they don't, the touch dries up as well, because when somebody goes in for a hug, they're like, oh my God, they're trying to have sex with me and I don't want to have sex. So, they push them away. And, to realize that we need touch for different things. Sometimes, like, I actually had, my ex-boyfriend and I used to do this where one or the other of us it would be the end of the day and we'd be really stressed and we kind of want to have sex, but, we weren't right in that right headspace. So, one or the other of us would like lay down and, do touch and then we'd switch off. And then at the end, we'd be like, okay, yeah, now we're ready to have sex, because we had a chance to relax. So, realizing that, that we can use touch, that I think when we expand our definition of why and how we touch each other, that it's something that makes us more human. It gives us access to a range of emotions and connection. It's like if you use touch when you're stressed out and you need to relax, or you need it for, if you're grieving and you need comfort, you're exhausted and you need some sort of respite, you're feeling traumatized, it's like, especially as our world gets more complicated and stressful and uncertain, it's like we need these places to feel safe with each other and to take care of each other, regulate our emotions, get our nervous system down off of DEFCON 5. Oh wait, I think it's the other way around. I think DEFCON 5 is the lowest, and DEFCON 1 is when you have to be really scared, but you get the idea. Yeah, so just recognizing that, especially if you're in a monogamous relationship and you expect your partner to provide you with everything, then, you should give each other a chance to provide each other with more of this comfort when you don't have to really be doing anything. You can just be present and holding them or touching them. And yeah.
Well, Epiphany, I wonder people are kind of curious about, they want to learn more about you, all the wonderful services, coaching sessions that you have. Where can people get a hold of you?
Okay, the best place to find me is my website, which is www.nurturinghumantouch.com. And that has links. Unfortunately, I think about starting to offer Karuna Sessions again all the time. It's like it was such a deeply satisfying thing for me. So I might start doing that again. But there's links to find the book there. I also, when I was in school, in addition to getting an incredible education in marketing and public health, I was also certified as a health and wellness coach. And so I've started doing a little bit of coaching around this topic. I'm really excited to dive into that more because, people have come up with these incredible creative solutions of touch and, expanding out their understanding and how that changes how they move through the world and interact with people. It's really great to see. Sometimes I post stuff on my Instagram, which is somebody_hold_me. I post a lot about podcasts. Sometimes I post like musings about touch, things that I come across in the world or things that I'm thinking about. And there's a Facebook page for the book as well. And I think I'm still on Twitter. I haven't been using it that much, but yeah, my website is probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Well, thank you so much for coming in the show and sharing this important topic with our listeners. And I'm looking forward for your second book. And it's lovely to
Yeah, me too.